Please welcome founder and CEO at Mongabay, Rhett Butler.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to speak up my journey from being just a person who's passionate about rainforests to trying to do something about saving these places. So, for those who aren't familiar with Mongabay, we're a conservation news service. My journey really began though at a very early age. So, I had the great fortune of having a mother who's a travel agent and a father who traveled a lot for business. My family prioritized travel growing up, and we go to places like Venezuela instead of Disneyland. I had a special love for herps, so reptiles and amphibians, and I felt that the best herps were in the rainforest. So I would constantly beg my parents to take me to the rainforest, and a few times I had opportunities to actually do that. As I grew older, I became more aware of what was happening in rainforests, and the first time it touched me personally was when I was 12. I went to this beautiful forest in eastern Ecuador, and we stayed with a fairly traditional indigenous community, and I had an amazing time going out with the kids my age and looking for frogs and catching fish and whatnot. I came home, and a few months later, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about this huge oil spill that had happened on the Rio Napo, upriver from where I had been. So that area I visited was covered in oil. And so all I could think about is what had happened to my friends in the forest and the animals. The thing that really moved me to action, though, was an experience I had in high school. I was able to go to Borneo, specifically Malaysian Borneo, to this absolutely beautiful forest. And this forest is very special. It's home to amazing creatures. So, I mean, even the insects are beautiful. Of course, they're wonderful herps, like this flying dragon. And I had a really special experience there where I was sitting by this natural pool. And I was sitting there picking leeches off my socks because there are lots of leeches in Borneo. And a wild orangutan passed over me, and it was just this just really magical experience. So some of my fondest memories at that point in my life were from that forest. Um, I came home and I kept in correspondence with a scientist there. This is before I had access to email, and I learned that that forest was pulped to make paper a few months later. And so once that happened, I decided I wanted to raise awareness about what was happening to forests. And so when I began in college, I started writing this book about rainforests. So my major was actually math and econ, had nothing to do with rainforests or biology, but it was really my passion. So nights and weekends, I'd work on this book. Thanks to AP credit, I was able to finish school a year early, and I spent that extra year working on the book. I found a publisher. It went through peer reviews. The publisher came back and said, "We're ready to publish this book, but because we're an academic press, we don't have money to put pictures in it. So we're going to run some grayscale images." And to me, that really defeated the purpose, because how could I convey the beauty of rainforest without beautiful photos? And so I thought, well, I didn't write this book for money. I wrote it for impact. So I decided to post the book on the internet so people could read it for free. And I decided to name it after another special place, this island off Madagascar. So the reason that I chose this island is it's kind of my idea of paradise. It's covered with rainforest. It's surrounded by coral reefs, and humpback whales go and breed right nearby. It's also home to wonderful wildlife. So everything from lemurs to amazing chameleons and geckos, to frogs and these strange creatures like this thing called a tenrec. So again, this is a really special place for me. I also wanted to have a unique name. So back if you went to Excite or Alta Vista in the late 90s, if you typed in Mongabay into the internet, the only thing that would come up would be my website. So it's easy to see who is linking to my website and talking about it and whatnot. But the reality was I wasn't going to run a website for a living. I needed a real job. And so I moved here to Silicon Valley and started working in the tech sector. But I kept working on the website nights and weekends, and much to my surprise, it grew popular. So popular, in fact, that it started to generate revenue, and I thought maybe I quit my job and pursue my passion. And so that's what I did. So once I started doing Mongabay full time, I was able to pursue all sorts of new projects under it. So one of the first things I did was start to take pictures everywhere I traveled. So I've now posted and captioned more than 150,000 photos from all around the world. I also created a section for children that's I had translated in nearly 40 languages. And then I also created a news service. And the idea is that I believed there are all sorts of advocacy groups out there, but there was sort of a gap where of good information on forests. And so I thought, well, by doing this, it could have a real impact. And so essentially the first several years of Mongabay was just a guy in his pajamas in his apartment writing articles. But because there weren't many other people covering this issue, Mongabay kind of grew in stature and people became more aware of it. And then after a few years, I got an intern who I eventually hired, and we had like a legitimate organization. But really, our opportunity for scale and impact was still pretty limited. And I had all these ideas I wanted to pursue that there was no real business model for. And so I decided to form a nonprofit as a way to pursue these other ideas. So one of the first ideas was create an Indonesian language environmental news service. You might think, well, that seems very random, but back around 2010, I saw Indonesia being at this critical point in its development where it could shift from this business model of driving deforestation to something different, something more like Brazil had in the mid 2000s, where there was this huge reduction in deforestation without affecting economic growth. And so I thought, well, because in Indonesia you have a lot of environmental degradation is driven by corruption in the natural resources sector. Journalism is actually an intervention that can help make a difference. So by increasing transparency, you can create accountability. And so I thought this Indonesian language news service could actually have a much bigger impact than one would think. And so I decided to form a nonprofit, and I sent out a grant application and it got approved. And then I went over to Indonesia and hired a team. And within a couple weeks of hiring the team, we launched a website. And within 3 months, it was the most popular Indonesian language environmental news service. So that was really exciting, and I didn't speak a word of Indonesian. So it was really like this, I hired some really great people, and they ran with it, and it was a really exciting time. It was also an interesting time because Indonesia was way ahead of places like Silicon Valley on things like social media. And so it was a place where you could test new ideas and then bring them to this bigger market. One of the things that we tested out in Indonesia was this idea of building a network of local contributors. And so today we have about 60 contributors in about 50 cities and towns across Indonesia. What's great about this is you can both do deep reporting, but because you have all these sort of nodes of the deep reporting, then it bubbles up to the surface. You can also do very high level reporting. So it's a really powerful tool, and we've since scaled that globally. And so one of the things that we've had a lot of success with is using technology for our journalism. And so back in 2014, this new platform launched called Global Forest Watch. And the idea was it aggregated data from all different sources and put it on a map so you could see what was happening. And so to me, this seemed like a really great tool for journalism because you could get data from the field and then send journalists to do reporting on what's actually happening on the ground. So I wanted to test this concept. And so in 2014, I used Global Forest Watch and identified a point in North Sumatra, which is part of Indonesia. And the reason I picked this place was it's the only point on Earth which has rhinos, orangutans, tigers, and elephants living in the same forest. And from this image, you can see that there are these pink areas which represent potential deforestation, and the blue is a nominally protected area. And so I thought, well, let's see what's actually happening on the ground here. First, for my laptop at home, I could do a satellite overlay, and I could see that, okay, these dark areas are clearly forest, and the pink is, occurring in these forest areas that are supposed to be protected. So we use this as a starting point. We discovered a legal road, we followed it, and we came over this ridge, and then we found this area that had just been cleared for an oil palm plantation. So this forest clearing had happened in the previous 3 months. We talked with the local workers, and they said they had to chase off elephants on a regular basis. So it was a very high biodiversity area that was converted for this. And so I thought, wow, this is really a powerful tool. So leveraging this technology could be, really transformative for journalism around rainforests and other environmental issues. And so one of my favorite examples from sort of this approach is from a few years ago. There was a company that had an IPO in London, and it was a cacao company. And the reason that was significant was this was back in 2014 when global commodity prices were declining, except for cacao. So investors were really excited about this company and had this wonderful story of working with indigenous people and being sustainable and all this other stuff. Well, we were monitoring Global Forest Watch, and we saw these geometric patterns popping up in the western Amazon, which is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. It turned out it was this company that was clearing this forest. So we sent an investigative reporter. We talked to some of the world's best scientists, some of who are in this room, who are monitoring this area. And so we had all this great data, satellites, airplane. We could see the biodiversity. We could see the carbon that was being lost. So we went ahead and we were preparing this story. And then the company sent a law firm after us and tried to shut down this reporting. So when I got this letter, I went back to the law firm and said, thanks for your message, but I just want to let you know you don't have libel or slander. We have all this scientific data here, so you can't say that this isn't true. I also looked at your corporate social responsibility policy, and this directly violates that policy, by representing this firm. And I've noticed you've prided yourself as being a free speech law firm, so this undermines the very founding principles of your firm. So again, thank you for your message. We're proceeding with the story. We ended up doing a bunch more investigative reporting. Other news outlets started doing reporting, and NGOs started campaigning around the issue, and indigenous groups started doing protests. Fast forward 2 years, the company's permits were revoked, and it was delisted from the stock exchange. And the reason that was important was the company was planning to clear another 100,000 hectares for oil palm plantations. And so that reporting, the subsequent reporting by other groups, and then the advocacy around this and the indigenous people, that led to 100,000 hectares not being deforested, which translates to about 30 million tons of CO2. So that was a really exciting example. But the thing is that that's an ag example, but as we'll learn from the rest of this event tonight, mining is happening all over the world. So these are just a few pictures from the previous few years. I mean, so this is gold mining in Peru. This is in Madagascar. This is Indonesia. And so there's a huge need for ways to leverage technology and other innovations to go after this issue, because it's absolutely critical. So you might wonder, this is great. These are far off places, and why does this matter to me? Well, there are reasons that we should care about rainforests. So first of all, I think most people are aware now that forests store very large amounts of carbon. And so by some estimates, up to 30% of where we need to go in terms of reducing carbon emissions can come from protecting, restoring, and regrowing rainforests. So it's a really critical thing for addressing climate change. Forests are a critical part of that. A second thing is forests play a really important role locally for both temperature and generating rainfall. So as much as 70% of South America's GDP is produced in areas that are fed by rainfall from the Amazon. So if the Amazon tips towards a drier savanna-like ecosystem, you're talking about potentially destabilizing a really critical component for a large share of South America's GDP. So that's a pretty scary thing. Fires in the Amazon have made a lot of news recently. Well, guess what? There's also fires in Indonesia that are burning right now. Healthy forests in the tropics don't burn as readily as degraded forests and deforested areas. And so when you have droughts and you combine that with rising temperatures, that's a recipe for more fire. And so these kind of fires are something we can expect more of, especially as deforestation continues. So it's something that we need to really be aware of. Something that's less on people's mind probably is forests account for at least half of terrestrial biodiversity. So when these forests are destroyed, you're losing critical habitat for species. And so we're in the midst of what scientists are calling, the sixth great extinction. This is real. The extinction rates are anywhere between 1,000 and 10,000 times the normal background rate. So again, as these forests are destroyed, it's putting a lot of species at risk. And then finally, there are millions of people around the world who are dependent on forests for their livelihoods. And so we don't feel it as much here in say, Silicon Valley, but rural populations are heavily dependent on forests for everything from food to water to medicinal plants and things like that. So again, these forests are not only important to local people, but they really touch us here. And so again, it's why looking for innovation that gives us leverage for addressing these problems is really critical. So thank you again for listening and joining us tonight.